Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They say in the foothills of Tennessee there are places where the past refuses to die, stories buried in whispers, sealed in silence, left to rot behind boarded-up houses and forgotten churchyards. And every so often, one of those stories surfaces, jagged and unfinished, daring us to look closer. In 1975, a small Appalachian community carried a secret that even today is rarely spoken of. They knew her as a mother, a widow, a woman who lived off the land with little but her own hands to sustain her. But what they didn't say, what they wouldn't say, was that she raised her sons not only as children, but as husbands. The details are not found in any official record. They linger instead in broken testimonies, local folklore, and the kind of evidence a town tries to burn rather than preserve. A family tree that twisted in on itself until bloodlines were no longer straight lines, but circles feeding back upon themselves. And at the center of it all, her. Imagine a farmhouse standing alone at the edge of a mountain road. The windows are shuttered, the roof is sagging, the soil around it dry and bitter. Yet from inside that house, the strangest thing happened. The rules of family collapsed. Sons grew into roles they should never have known, and the woman who bore them became something else entirely. The neighbors would speak of her only in hushed tones, warning their children to keep away. They said she had eyes that seemed to know when you were lying, and a voice that could draw you in like a hymn sung backward. To outsiders, she was just another poor mountain woman living in obscurity. But to those who knew, she was the most inbred woman of Tennessee, he matriarch of a secret that had rotted generations from within. And the question that remains, nearly half a century later, is not just what she did, but why. The first traces of her life are scattered and incomplete, like pages torn from a book and buried under dirt. Born sometime in the 1930s, she came of age in a part of Tennessee where poverty was not an exception, but a rule. Records are scarce, and what survives carries only fragments. A name misspelled on a birth certificate, a census entry with the wrong year, a marriage license that disappeared. It is almost as though the paper trail itself tried to erase her. Those who remembered her as a girl described her as quiet, with a strange intensity about her eyes. She never laughed the way other children did, never played in the open fields, and was said to spend long hours alone by the creek, whispering to herself. By the time she was a teenager, whispers in the town already hinted at something unnatural in her home. Her father drank heavily, her mother was sickly and withdrawn, and behind closed doors there were rumors of things not fit to speak of, carried from one kitchen table to another in uneasy silence. It is here that the roots of her story begin to coil. For in communities where poverty and isolation reign, the lines of kinship often blur. What was seen as survival by some was whispered as sin by others. Families folded inward, generation upon generation, until cousins were no longer cousins, but husbands and wives. And within her own family, this pattern deepened, shaping her view of love, loyalty, and the unspoken roles between men and women. By the time she turned 20, she had already lost more than most. Her mother had died young, her father vanished one winter and never returned, and so she became both daughter and keeper of the family land. When she married, it was to a man much older, a drifter who provided nothing but a few years of companionship before leaving her a widow with 3 small boys. The townsfolk pitied her, but they did not help her. They left her to raise those boys alone, in a house where loneliness pressed against the walls like a storm refusing to break. It was then that the rumors grew darker. The boys never went to school, they were rarely seen in town, and when they were, people noticed the way they lingered close to her, not as sons clinging to their mother, but as something stranger, more unsettling. By the early 1970s, the house on the ridge had taken on a reputation of its own. Locals avoided the narrow dirt road that led up to it, swearing that strange noises drifted from its walls at night, low voices, arguments that turned into laughter, and sometimes a sound that was neither quite human nor animal. Few dared to approach, and those who did often returned with stories they would only share after a drink or two, their voices lowering as if the woman herself might overhear them from miles away. The sons were no longer children. They had grown into men, though in a way that seemed unfinished, unshaped by the outside world. Their hair was unkempt, their clothes mismatched, and their eyes carried the same unsettling stare as their mother's. What was most disturbing, however, was their closeness to her, how they walked beside her with a sense of possession, how their hands brushed hers, not in accident, but in familiarity, how their gazes lingered on her in a way no son should ever look at his mother. A few stories circulated through the town, always framed as rumor, but told with a sharp conviction that suggested otherwise. One came from a traveling preacher who claimed he was invited to supper at the house one Sunday evening. He said the way they sat around the table made his stomach turn. The sons spoke to her not as children, but as though each one was vying for her favor, her approval, her touch. The preacher left early, never returning, and years later confessed he had felt as though he had glimpsed a family that was no longer a family at all, but something older, more primitive, more dangerous. Neighbors swore that at night they could see the flicker of kerosene lamps through the windows, shadows moving in ways that suggested rituals of a kind. Some believed it was witchcraft. Others whispered that it was simply hunger for comfort, for touch, that had twisted itself into something unspeakable. But whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. The mother had blurred every boundary until the word son no longer meant what it was supposed to. And what made it all the more terrifying was how natural it seemed to them. There was no shame in their eyes, no secrecy in their gestures. To them, this was not sin. It was survival. It was life as they had been taught it, an inheritance of silence and shadows carried forward without a second thought. The year 1975 marked the turning point, the moment when what had been whispered for decades could no longer be ignored. That summer, a fire broke out on the property, a blaze that consumed part of the barn and left the farmhouse blackened with smoke. Firemen from the nearest town arrived too late to save much, but what they saw inside the house lingered with them for years. They spoke of mattresses pushed together in the living room, of belongings that seemed shared rather than separate, of photographs tacked to the walls showing the mother with her sons in ways that felt unnervingly intimate. No official report mentioned these things, but in backroom conversations they were recounted with shivers and half-drunken disbelief. It was after the fire that the sheriff paid a visit. He claimed it was just routine, checking to see if anyone had been injured, ensuring the blaze hadn't spread. But according to one deputy who later broke his silence, the sheriff left that house pale as ash. Whatever he saw inside he carried to his grave. Officially, nothing came of it. No charges, no investigation. Unofficially, it was the point at which the town stopped pretending not to know. From then on, the family lived in near total isolation. Supplies were delivered rarely, mostly flour and sugar traded for game or handmade quilts. The sons, now fully grown, were seen less and less. When they did appear, their bodies carried the marks of malnourishment, thin frames, pale skin, eyes that avoided the sun, yet they clung to their mother with the same unnatural devotion. People said they were no longer just her children, they were her partners, her keepers, her prisoners. And here lies the most haunting question. Who held the power? Was she the one who ensnared them, weaving her loneliness into a net from which they could not escape? Or had the sons, raised without school, without friends, without any sense of life beyond her, shaped her into what they needed, a mother, a lover, a queen of a kingdom no one else could enter? In the years that followed, the family was spoken of less and less, until they became something like a ghost story told to frighten children. But the truth was far darker than a simple tale to make young ones behave. It was a sickness of inheritance, a tangle of bloodlines that twisted until there was no beginning and no end. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The deeper we dig, the more we realize this wasn't just one woman's madness. It was the culmination of generations of silence. Appalachian families of the early 20th century often lived in pockets so remote that the outside world may as well have been another planet. Roads were poor, schools were distant, and churches sometimes only gathered once every few months. In such isolation, the rules of society dissolved. Kinship became a closed loop. Families married into themselves, not out of malice, but out of necessity, or at least, that is how it began. Her story, then, was not the beginning, but the continuation of a long pattern. Old genealogical scraps hint at cousins marrying cousins, siblings whose roles were quietly altered, unions hidden under the cover of poverty and shame. By the time she came of age, she had already inherited more than just a plot of land. She had inherited a twisted script that had been passed down for decades. What she did was not an invention, it was a repetition. But even within that repetition, there was something uniquely terrifying. She did not hide. Unlike others who cloaked their secrets in outward respectability, she seemed to embrace her role, bending her sons into something they should never have become. It was as though she had accepted the curse fully, wearing it like a crown of thorns. The neighbors said her sons looked at her with a loyalty so fierce it bordered on worship. And perhaps that was the final transgression, not merely the breaking of taboos, but the creation of a household where she became both god and lover, the axis of a private world spinning in on itself. When outsiders caught a glimpse, it left them shaken. A postal worker later admitted he once saw her through a window, seated her to a table while her sons hovered around her, their hands resting lightly on her shoulders. He said her face was serene, almost triumphant, like a queen presiding over a court no one else could enter. He never returned to that house again. And though the family faded from public view after the fire, the memory of them clung to the town like smoke. Parents warned their children never to wander near the ridge, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of something worse, something human, something real. As the years wore on, the family became less flesh and blood and more myth. By the late 1970s, few in town claimed to have seen them at all. Some whispered they had moved deeper into the mountains, abandoning the burned-out farmhouse for a shack even more hidden from the road. Others believed they never left, that they stayed there in the charred shell, surviving off roots, game, and each other. But the most disturbing accounts came not from townsfolk, but from those rare travelers who strayed too close. A hunter claimed he stumbled upon the property one autumn afternoon. He said the air was heavy, unnaturally still, and though he never saw them directly, he swore he heard voices carrying across the woods, soft, rhythmic, almost like chanting. Another wanderer, a mechanic whose truck broke down nearby, recalled that when he knocked on the door for help, the mother appeared, flanked by two of her sons. Their faces were expressionless, their bodies pale and thin, but their eyes burned with something unspoken. He said she did not ask what he needed, she only asked why he had come. By the 1980s, no official record of the family remained. Death certificates were never filed, graves were never marked. It was as though the lineage dissolved into the soil itself, swallowed by the mountain that had hidden them all along. Yet the silence only deepened the mystery. For every generation that passed, the story grew darker, retold in whispers at schoolyards and in bars. The woman who raised her sons as husbands, the cursed bloodline of Tennessee. To historians, the tale remains both maddening and elusive. No courthouse files, no news articles, only fragments, scraps of oral testimony, a burned farmhouse, and a handful of photographs whose provenance no one can confirm. And that absence, that deliberate emptiness, may be the most chilling part of all. For silence is rarely accident. Also, someone chose to bury this story. Someone chose to keep it hidden, to erase her name, to leave behind only the memory of a woman whose life defied the natural order. And yet, when you strip away the rumors and folklore, what remains is a portrait of isolation pushed to its breaking point. A mother who, instead of raising her sons to leave her, raised them to never let her go. A family that became a prison, where the bars were not made of steel, but of love twisted into possession. Today, nearly 50 years later, the story of the woman on the ridge lingers like a shadow no one can shake. The farmhouse is long gone, reduced to little more than a stone foundation swallowed by vines and roots. Travelers who stumble across it rarely recognize what they've found. To them, it's just another ruin, one of thousands scattered through Appalachia. But to those who know, to those who grew up with the whispers, that broken foundation is a wound that never healed. The truth is that the family's bloodline did not simply vanish. Somewhere, descendants still walk among us, men and women whose family trees curl back upon themselves, whose grandparents never spoke of their origins. Perhaps they changed their names. Perhaps they scattered across the South, carrying fragments of the story like shards of glass buried deep in their pockets. And perhaps, without knowing it, they carry more than just a name. They carry the weight of what was done, of what was chosen, of what can never be undone. When people speak of her now, they do so with an almost ritual caution. They never use her name. They never speak directly of her sons. Instead, they let the legend stand, a kind of warning etched into the collective memory. There are lines that should never be crossed, and families that close themselves off from the world risk becoming something other than family altogether. Some believe she was evil, others believe she was simply broken, a victim of a cycle too ancient to resist. The cruelest truth may be that she was both, a woman shaped by her past, yet still the architect of her son's future. A mother and a lover, a keeper and a destroyer, remembered not for her kindness or her cruelty, but for the way she blurred the two into something unrecognizable. And so her story lives on, not in textbooks or archives, but in the unsettled silence of a town that refuses to speak of her. A silence that feels heavier than words, as though by keeping her memory locked away, they might keep the curse itself from spreading. But secrets have a way of enduring. They seep through the cracks, carried in whispers and late-night stories, until one day they find their way back into the light. And now, you've heard it too, the story of the most inbred woman of Tennessee, 1975. A story you were never meant to know,